The silence in the great hall stretched like a living thing, coiling around the throats of every wolf gathered beneath the vaulted stone ceiling. Moonlight poured through the ancient stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the assembled packs. Crimson, sapphire, amber, painting the ceremony in shades of destiny and blood. The air hung thick with incense and expectation, with the weight of tradition older than memory itself. Every eye fixed upon the dais where the Alpha King stood, a mountain of controlled power wrapped in ceremonial furs and silver chains that gleamed against his bare, muscled chest. Briston Ashenwolf dominated the space without effort. He stood well over 6 feet, his frame carved from battle and birthright, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of every pack in the kingdom. His long black hair fell past his shoulders, tied partially back to reveal the sharp angles of his face, the strong jaw shadowed by a dark beard that only enhanced the severity of his features. His eyes, golden and fierce as a winter sun, surveyed the hall with the detached assessment of a predator who had never known defeat. This was a man who commanded armies with a glance, who ended wars with his presence alone, who had never bowed to anyone or anything in his entire existence. The mating ceremony had reached its apex. The sacred words had been spoken, the ancient rites performed. And yet, the bond, the mystical connection that should have flared between Alpha and chosen mate, remained dormant, a spark refusing to catch flame. Zephyra Frostshade stood before him on the ceremonial platform, and she did not tremble. She should have. Every instinct ingrained in werewolf society demanded it. But Zephyra had never been particularly good at doing what she should. At 25, she had survived things that would have broken stronger wolves, had carved out her existence in the harsh northern territories, where only the resilient endured. Her skin was pale as fresh snow, her hair a cascade of white silk that fell to her waist, braided with silver threads for the ceremony. The red dress she wore was a deliberate choice, not the traditional white of submission, but crimson like wine, like blood, like defiance itself. It clung to her curves before flowing around her legs, a river of rebellion in a sea of tradition. She met the Alpha King's gaze without flinching, her chin raised just enough to broadcast her refusal to be diminished. Her eyes, storm gray and sharp as winter ice, held something that made even the eldest wolves shift uncomfortably in their seats. Not challenge, exactly. Not disrespect. Something far more dangerous than either. Certainty. The High Elder's voice had faded minutes ago, his final blessing hanging unanswered in the charged atmosphere. The assembly waited. Briston waited, his jaw tight, a muscle ticking near his temple as he stared at this woman who had somehow been chosen by fate, or cruel coincidence, to stand beside him. She was beautiful. He could acknowledge that with the same detachment, he might note a well-crafted weapon. But beauty meant nothing. Power meant everything. And she had none that he could see. The silence pressed down, suffocating, demanding. Someone would have to break it. Someone would have to acknowledge what everyone could feel, the absence of the bond that should have sealed their union before the gathered packs. Zephyra smiled then, slow and deliberate, the expression transforming her face from merely beautiful to absolutely arresting. She took a single step forward, closing the ceremonial distance between them with a confidence that sent ripples of shock through the watching crowd. No one approached the Alpha King uninvited. No one dared breach the sacred space during the ritual. No one except her. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made something unfamiliar stir in Briston's chest. Then she spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, each word enunciated with perfect, devastating clarity. "You're my puppy." The great hall erupted into chaos. Before we begin the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. In the pinned comment, you'll find a special selection of the best Amazon audiobooks that inspire our stories. If you purchase any audiobook through those links, you'll be directly supporting the channel and helping us create more stories. Tell us where you're watching from and how old you are in the comments. I hope you enjoy the story. Gasps tore through the assembly like wind through winter trees. Several pack members leaped to their feet, hands flying to weapons that weren't there, instinct screaming at the insult delivered to their king. The High Elder's face drained of color, his ancient hands trembling as he raised them in a gesture meant to restore order, but achieving nothing. The Beta guards flanking the dais moved forward, ready to drag Zephyra away, to punish such blasphemy with swift and brutal efficiency. But Briston raised one hand, and the world stopped. His command was absolute. The guards froze mid-step. The outcry died in 100 throats. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Alpha King's wrath to descend upon this foolish woman who had dared the unthinkable. Briston stared at Zephyra, and something shifted behind his golden eyes. Something that had been sleeping, dormant, waiting for precisely this moment to crack open like a seed buried in frozen ground, finally touched by spring. The bond stirred, not with the explosive recognition the legends promised, not with the overwhelming surge of certainty that should have bound them the moment their eyes met. Instead, it unfurled slowly, cautiously, like a wild thing emerging from its den to test the air. It whispered through Briston's veins, soft as snowfall, insistent as the tide, carrying with it a truth that made his breath catch in his chest. Mine. The word resonated through every fiber of his being, but it carried none of the possessive dominance he had expected. Instead, it felt like recognition, like remembering something he had never known but had always been searching for, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized was incomplete. Zephyra didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't apologize. She simply stood there, watching him with those storm-gray eyes, waiting to see what he would do, testing him, measuring him. And in that moment, Briston understood with perfect clarity what she had done. She hadn't insulted him. She had challenged the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about power, about dominance, about what it meant to be alpha. She had stripped away the titles and the ceremony and the weight of expectation, and she had looked at the man beneath the crown to ask one simple question. "Are you strong enough to handle me?" The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of something that might become one. Around them, the hall remained frozen. Hundreds of wolves holding their collective breath, waiting for blood, for punishment, for the natural order to be violently restored. Briston took a step toward her, then another. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough to touch, close enough to scent the wildflower and frost fragrance that clung to her skin, close enough to see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. The only sign that she wasn't as calm as she pretended to be. He leaned down, his mouth near her ear, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched for her alone. A rumble of sound that vibrated through the space between them. "Bold words, little wolf. I hope you're prepared to back them up." Zephyra's smile widened, showing teeth. "I've never said anything I wasn't ready to stand behind, Alpha King. The question is whether you're ready to be more than just a title and a throne." The bond flared stronger, heat spreading through Briston's chest like molten gold. His wolf, that primal part of himself that had ruled his instincts since his first shift, surged forward with interest. Not aggression. Interest. The beast that had never bowed to anyone recognized something in this woman, something that spoke to the wild, untamed part of him that existed beneath the crown and the duty and the endless weight of leadership. He straightened, turning to face the assembly without releasing Zephyra from his peripheral vision. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall, resonating with the authority that had never failed him. The bond has awakened. Another wave of shock rippled through the crowd, but this time it carried a different quality. Confusion, uncertainty. Because if the bond had awakened, if fate had truly chosen this pairing, then the woman's audacious words took on a different meaning entirely. Not insult, but intimacy. Not disrespect, but the prerogative of a mate to speak freely. The High Elder recovered first, his weathered face smoothing into practiced serenity as he raised his staff. Then let the ceremony be completed. Let the union be sealed before the moon and the assembled packs. Let the bond be recognized and honored. The ritual words flowed over them like water, ancient and unchanging, binding them together in the eyes of pack law and werewolf tradition. But Briston barely heard them. His attention remained fixed on Zafira, on the way she stood tall and unflinching as the elder marked their foreheads with sacred oils, as their hands were bound together with silver cord, as the assembly howled their acceptance into the night. Through it all, she met his gaze with that same unshakable certainty, that same quiet defiance that said she knew exactly what she was doing and refused to apologize for it. And through it all, the bond between them grew stronger, weaving invisible threads from his soul to hers, creating a connection that transcended pack law and ceremony to touch something deeper, something primal and true. When the ritual finally ended, when they were declared bound before gods and wolves alike, Briston led Zafira from the dais. The assembly parted before them, hundreds of wolves bowing their heads in respect or submission or simple shock at what they had witnessed. But Briston's focus remained singular, his hand wrapped around Zafira's, the silver cord still binding their wrists together, as tradition demanded until they reached the privacy of the royal chambers. The walk through the castle corridors felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. Guards snapped to attention as they passed. Servants pressed themselves against walls, their eyes downcast. The massive doors to the Alpha King's quarters swung open at their approach, revealing a suite of rooms that spoke of power and isolation in equal measure. Dark woods and stone walls, furs thrown across furniture carved from ancient trees, weapons mounted as decoration and warning. A fire burned in the massive hearth, casting dancing shadows across everything. The doors closed behind them with a finality that seemed to echo through Briston's bones. He turned to face Zafira, and for the first time in his life, found himself uncertain of what to say. She solved the problem by speaking first, her voice carrying that same fearless quality it had held in the hall. "You can stop looking at me like you're trying to decide whether I'm a threat or a treasure. I'm neither. I'm just myself, and that's all I've ever been interested in being." Briston moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the moonlit grounds below. The bond hummed between them, insistent, demanding acknowledgement. "You insulted me in front of the entire kingdom, in front of every alpha, every pack leader, every wolf who has sworn loyalty to this throne. You understand that, don't you?" "Did I?" Zafira's footsteps were soft on the stone floor as she approached. She didn't touch him, but he could feel her presence like heat against his back. Or did I simply refuse to pretend that power and strength are the same thing? That commanding armies makes you immune to being seen as something other than a weapon? He turned to face her, and the words that had been coiling in his chest since the ceremony finally broke free. "You called me your puppy. You diminished everything I am, everything I've built, everything I've fought to protect and preserve." "No." Zafira shook her head, her white hair catching the firelight like captured moonbeams. "I reminded you that beneath the crown and the title and the fear everyone carries when they look at you, you're still just a man, a wolf, a creature capable of more than conquest and command, and that terrified you more than any enemy ever has." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. Briston had spent his entire life building walls, creating distance, ensuring that no one, not enemies, not allies, not even his own pack, could ever find a weakness to exploit. He had made himself into something more than human, more than wolf, a symbol, an ideal, a force of nature that could not be questioned or challenged or touched. And in 3 words, she had stripped all of it away. "You don't know me," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Not yet." Zafira stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her gray eyes, could smell the wildflower scent that seemed to be her alone. But I will. And you'll know me. That's what this is, isn't it? This bond we both feel growing stronger with every passing moment. It's not about submission or dominance. It's about recognition. About finding someone who sees you, really sees you, and doesn't turn away. Briston's hands clenched at his sides. The bond was singing now, a constant thrum beneath his skin that urged him closer, that wanted to close the distance between them and claim what fate had apparently decided was his. But he had spent too long being in control to surrender to instinct so easily. "You don't fear me," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Should I?" Zafira tilted her head, studying him with that unnerving intensity. "You've done nothing to make me afraid. You're fierce to your enemies, yes, brutal in battle, uncompromising with those who threaten what you've built. But you're not cruel. You're not a tyrant. You're just—" She paused, searching for words. "Alone. So isolated by your own strength that you've forgotten what it feels like to let someone stand beside you instead of behind you." The accuracy of her observation should have angered him. Instead, it cracked something open inside his chest, something that had been locked away so long he'd forgotten it existed. Loneliness, the kind that came not from being surrounded by people, but from never being truly known. From always being the alpha, the king, the warrior, but never just Briston. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering near her face before finally, carefully, tucking a strand of white hair behind her ear. The touch sent electricity racing through him, the bond flaring bright and hot at the simple contact. Zafira's breath hitched, just slightly, and he saw his own reaction mirrored in her eyes. The surprise, the intensity, the recognition of something bigger than both of them. "I could have had you removed from the ceremony," he said softly, his hand still lingering near her face. "Had you punished for the insult. No one would have questioned it. But you didn't." Her voice was equally soft, but steady. "Because some part of you, maybe the part that's been buried under duty and expectation for so long you forgot it existed, recognized that I wasn't trying to diminish you. I was trying to reach you, the real you, not the legend everyone else sees. And what makes you think there's a difference? Because I've seen it." Zafira lifted her hand, placing it over his heart, and the bond between them surged like a tidal wave. In that moment when you raised your hand to stop the guards, when you could have unleashed your wrath but chose restraint instead, when you felt the bond awaken and instead of using it to dominate, you chose to listen. That's the man I called my puppy. The one who's strong enough to be gentle, fierce enough to choose mercy, powerful enough to be vulnerable. Briston's other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The beast within him was quiet now, settled in a way it had never been before. Not subdued, but satisfied, as if it had been waiting his entire life for this moment. This woman. This impossible connection that defied everything he thought he understood about bonds and mates and destiny. "You're infuriating," he murmured, but there was no heat in the words, only wonder. "I'm honest," she corrected, "and I'm not going anywhere. The bond is real, Briston. You feel it as clearly as I do. We can fight it, resist it, pretend that it's just ceremony and tradition binding us together. Or we can acknowledge that fate apparently has a sense of humor, putting the most stubborn, independent woman in the kingdom with the most dominant, controlling alpha in history." A sound escaped him then, startling them both. It took a moment for Briston to recognize it as laughter, genuine, unguarded laughter that he couldn't remember the last time he'd experienced. The absurdity of it, the perfect cosmic joke of being matched with someone who refused to be what everyone expected, broke through his carefully maintained composure. Zafira smiled at the sound, her whole face transforming with the expression. There he is, the man underneath the crown. "You're going to be trouble," Briston said, but he was smiling too, a rare expression that felt foreign on his face but somehow right. "Absolutely." Zafira's hands came up to rest against his chest, her fingers splaying over the steady beat of his heart. "But I'll also be loyal and honest, and strong enough to stand beside you when the kingdom needs its alpha king to be the warrior legend they believe you are. I won't try to change you, Briston. I won't try to soften your edges or make you something you're not. But I also won't let you forget that you're more than just power and duty, that you're allowed to be human, or wolf, sometimes too." The bond between them settled then, like a key turning in a lock, clicking into place with a rightness that resonated through every fiber of his being. Briston pulled Zafira closer, until no space remained between them, until he could feel her heart beating against his chest in perfect synchronization with his own. "My puppy," he repeated her words from the ceremony, testing them. They should have stung, should have felt like chains. Instead, they felt like freedom, like permission to be something other than the untouchable Alpha King for the first time in his life. "Mine," Zafira agreed, her voice fierce with possessive certainty. "And you're mine. Not because you're the Alpha King, not because of the crown or the throne or the power, but because when I looked at you during that ceremony, I saw someone worth standing beside. Someone worth challenging. Someone worth knowing." Briston kissed her then, unable to resist the pull any longer. It started gentle, a careful exploration, but quickly deepened as the bond flared between them like wildfire. She tasted like winter and wild things, like frost and freedom, and he couldn't get enough. Her hands tangled in his long hair, pulling him closer as she kissed him back with the same fearless intensity she brought to everything else. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Briston rested his forehead against hers. The world had shifted somehow, tilting on an axis he hadn't known existed. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. Didn't feel like the solitary pinnacle of power that everyone looked to but no one truly saw. "The court won't understand," he said quietly. "They'll expect you to submit, to fall in line with tradition. They'll whisper about your audacity, about how you insulted the Alpha King and should be punished for it. Let them whisper." Zafira's fingers traced patterns on his chest, following the lines of old scars visible above the ceremonial furs. "I'm not here to please the court. I'm here because fate decided we belong together, and I'm curious enough, or foolish enough, to see where that leads. But I need you to understand something, Briston. I won't pretend to be weak to make others comfortable. I won't diminish myself to fit their expectations. I'll stand beside you, support you, defend this kingdom with everything I have. But I'll do it as myself, not as some watered-down version they think a queen should be." "Good." The word was a growl, satisfaction and possessive pride mixing in his chest. "I don't want a weak queen. The kingdom doesn't need one. What we need is exactly what you are. Someone strong enough to challenge when I'm wrong, brave enough to stand firm when I'm right, and smart enough to know the difference." Zafira pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "You really mean that?" "I've never said anything I didn't mean." Briston echoed her earlier words back to her, watching understanding and something warmer bloom in her expression. "You were right, in the hall. I've spent so long being what everyone needed me to be that I forgot how to be anything else. But you..." He paused, struggling to articulate the feeling. "You make me remember that there's more to strength than force, more to power than dominance. You make me want to be better. Not different, not softer, but better." "That's what mates do," Zafira said simply. "We make each other better. We balance the scales. Where you're fierce, I'm fearless. Where I'm wild, you're steady. Together, we're something neither of us could be alone." The truth of it settled into Briston's bones, undeniable and absolute. The bond hummed between them, content now, no longer demanding acknowledgement, but simply existing, a constant connection that he could feel with every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of awareness. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the fire burned low and the moon tracked across the sky outside the windows. Talking sometimes, silent others, learning the rhythms of each other's breathing and the weight of each other's presence. It wasn't the wedding night the kingdom would expect, full of political alliance and careful distance. It was something far more dangerous and far more real. Two souls beginning the long process of truly knowing each other, of building something that could withstand the weight of a crown and the pressure of a kingdom. As dawn began to paint the horizon in shades of gold and rose, Zephyra stirred against his chest. What happens now? When we leave these rooms and face the court, face the reality of what we've become to each other? Briston considered the question, his arms tightening around her slightly. Now we show them what a true partnership looks like. Not submission and dominance, but balance, complementary strengths. We rule together, fight together, build something better than what came before. Together, Zephyra repeated, as if testing the word. Then she smiled, that fierce expression that had first caught his attention during the ceremony. I like the sound of that. So do I. And Briston realized with something approaching shock that he meant it. For the first time in his life, the thought of sharing his authority, his power, his throne, didn't feel like weakness. It felt like evolution, like becoming something greater than he could be alone. The bond pulsed between them, warm and steady and true. Briston had entered the mating ceremony expecting either a compliant partner or no partner at all. He had never imagined he would find an equal, someone who saw his strength and matched it with her own, someone who refused to be diminished by his power because she carried her own kind of strength, the kind that came not from physical dominance, but from unshakable certainty in who she was. As the sun rose fully over the kingdom, Briston Ashenwolf made a silent vow. He would be the alpha king the realm needed, fierce in battle, uncompromising with enemies, steady in leadership. But for Zephyra, he would also be something more, someone more. Not despite his power, but because of the freedom she gave him to be vulnerable alongside strong, gentle alongside fierce, human alongside legendary. She had called him her puppy in a hall full of witnesses, and instead of diminishing him, she had somehow made him more complete, more whole, more himself than he had ever been when isolated by the weight of his own strength. And he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of the woman who had been brave enough, or crazy enough, to challenge the Alpha King and awaken the bond that would change everything. The journey ahead would not be easy. The court would test them. Enemies would try to exploit what they perceived as weakness. Tradition would push back against change. But as Briston looked down at Zephyra, at the woman fate had chosen for him, he felt no fear, only certainty. Together, they would face whatever came. Together, they would forge a new path. Together, they would prove that true strength wasn't found in isolation, but in the courage to let someone stand beside you and see all the pieces you kept hidden from the world. The Alpha King and his queen. The warrior and the wild. The legend and the truth beneath it. Not perfect, but perfectly matched. Not without flaws, but complete in their acceptance of them. Not bound by duty alone, but by something far more powerful. Choice. The days that followed tested them in ways neither could have anticipated. The court whispered, exactly as Briston had predicted. Some called Zephyra's behavior during the ceremony scandalous. Others questioned whether the bond was real or manufactured. The older wolves, steeped in tradition, bristled at her refusal to perform the expected deference. But Zephyra moved through it all with the same unshakable confidence she had shown on the dais, never apologizing, never backing down. but also never crossing into disrespect. Briston watched her navigate the treacherous waters of court politics with growing admiration. She knew exactly when to be diplomatic and when to stand firm. She listened more than she spoke, learning the dynamics and power structures before inserting herself into them. And when she did speak, her words carried weight, because they were carefully chosen and honestly meant. The first real challenge came during a council meeting 2 weeks after the ceremony. The topic was a territorial dispute with a neighboring pack, and the discussion had devolved into various alpha voices all trying to shout over each other, each convinced their strategy was superior. Briston sat at the head of the massive oak table, his expression neutral, but his patience wearing thin. Zafira sat beside him, not behind as tradition dictated, but in the seat of equal authority he had insisted she occupy. She had been silent throughout the argument, her storm-gray eyes tracking from speaker to speaker, absorbing information. Now, as the volume reached a crescendo, she stood. The room didn't immediately quiet. Several wolves continued their arguments, too caught up in their own positions to notice. Briston didn't intervene, curious to see how she would handle it. Zafira didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her hand on the table or demand attention through force. She simply stood there, utterly still, utterly silent, waiting. One by one, the arguing voices faltered and fell quiet as the assembled alphas registered her presence, standing calm and composed while they raged around her. When the last voice died away, she spoke. "I've listened to 20 minutes of circular argument, and I haven't heard a single person suggest the most obvious solution." She paused, letting the words settle. "Ask them what they want." Confused looks ricocheted around the table. The beta in charge of border security frowned. "My queen, we know what they want. They want our territory. Do you?" Zafira tilted her head slightly. "Or is that an assumption based on historical conflicts and territorial instincts? Has anyone actually opened a dialogue with their leadership to understand their current needs and concerns?" The silence that followed was deafening. Briston felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Pride, he realized. She had identified the exact problem he had been circling without stating it, the tendency of wolves to assume conflict when communication might serve better. "Wolves respect strength," one of the older alphas growled. "Talking shows weakness." "No." Briston's voice cut through the room like a blade, and every head turned toward him. "Talking shows strategy. Attacking without understanding your enemy's true position shows arrogance. The Queen is right. We open communication channels. We learn what they actually want, and then we decide whether to negotiate or demonstrate why our borders are not to be tested." He turned to Zafira, letting the assembled council see the respect in his expression. "Well observed, my queen." The title had come naturally, without thought, but its impact rippled through the room. My queen. Not just a political designation, but a possessive claim, an acknowledgement of partnership. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this pairing would not follow traditional patterns. After the meeting, Briston found Zafira in one of the castle's smaller libraries, a room lined with ancient texts and illuminated by afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. She stood at one of the windows, looking out over the training grounds where younger wolves practiced combat forms. "That was well done," he said, moving to stand beside her. "In council." It was obvious. Zafira glanced at him, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They were so busy proving their dominance to each other that they forgot the actual objective was to protect the kingdom, not win an argument. Most wouldn't have dared point it out, especially not in their first council meeting as queen. "I'm not most people." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "And I need you to understand something, Briston. I won't be a decorative queen who sits silently while decisions are made. You gave me that seat at the table. I'm going to use it." "I know." He reached out, tucking a strand of white hair behind her ear in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "That's why I put you there. The kingdom doesn't need another version of me. It needs balance. Vision I might miss because I'm too close to tradition, or too focused on force as the first solution." Zafira's eyes softened slightly. "It's hard for you, isn't it? Sharing power. Letting someone else have input on decisions you've made alone for so long." The honesty of the question deserved an honest answer. "Yes," Briston admitted. "Every instinct I have says I should command, not consult. That showing any uncertainty to the council is dangerous. That a divided leadership is a weak leadership. But," she stepped closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest, "but you're not dividing my leadership. You're enhancing it, and fighting that truth just because it's unfamiliar would be stupid." He covered her hand with his own. "I'm learning, Zafira, to listen before I command, to consider options I would have dismissed before, to trust that strength comes in many forms, not just the ones I was taught to value." "Good." She rose on her toes, pressing a quick kiss to his jaw. "Because I have thoughts about the kingdom's agricultural policies, and I'm going to need you to not growl at me when I share them with the council next week." Briston did growl, but it was followed by laughter, that strange, unfamiliar sound that seemed to happen more and more often around her. "You're going to be the death of me." "Doubtful. You're far too stubborn to die." Zafira pulled away, moving to one of the bookshelves and running her fingers along the spines of ancient texts. "Besides, you promised we'd face things together, remember? That includes boring agricultural policy meetings." "Nothing about you is boring," Briston said, and meant it. Even standing still, just browsing books, she radiated a vitality that drew his attention like gravity. The bond hummed between them, content and constant, a steady reminder of the connection they shared. As spring turned to summer, their partnership deepened in ways that surprised them both. Briston found himself consulting Zafira on matters of state that he would have previously decided alone. Not because protocol demanded it, but because her perspective, shaped by different experiences and untainted by years of political maneuvering, often revealed angles he had missed. She had a gift for seeing patterns in chaos, for finding the human elements in political problems. In return, Zafira learned the weight of command from watching Briston lead. She saw how he balanced compassion with necessity, how he made hard choices that served the greater good even when they cost him personally, how he carried the burden of every life in the kingdom as if it were a physical weight on his shoulders. She had called him fierce, but she came to understand that his fierceness was born not from cruelty, but from the overwhelming responsibility he felt for those under his protection. The court slowly, grudgingly, began to accept their dynamic. It helped that Zafira never undermined Briston's authority publicly, never contradicted him in ways that would weaken his position. But she also never pretended to agree when she didn't, never smiled and nodded through policies she found objectionable. Instead, she mastered the art of private counsel and public unity, ensuring that their debates happened behind closed doors, while the kingdom saw only a united front. But not all threats came from politics or tradition. The first real danger appeared on a humid summer night when scouts brought word of a rogue pack crossing into their territory. Not the neighbors they had been negotiating with, but a different group entirely. One known for brutality and disregard for pack law. The war room filled quickly with Briston's most trusted warriors. Maps spread across the central table, marked with positions and potential strategies. The beta commander detailed the threat. Approximately 40 wolves, well armed, moving with purpose toward one of the outlying villages. "We ride at dawn," Briston said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of command. "Full strike force. We end this before they reach civilian populations." "No." Zafira's voice cut through the planning like a blade through silk. Every head in the room turned toward her. Several warriors bristled at the contradiction. Briston's expression remained neutral, but she could feel the tension radiating through the bond. Not anger, but surprise, caution, waiting to understand before reacting. "Explain," he said simply. Zafira moved to the map, her finger tracing the route the rogues were taking. "Look at their path. They're avoiding the main roads, staying to the wilderness, moving in a way that suggests they're not invading. They're fleeing. Something drove them into our territory." "That's not our concern," the beta growled. "They crossed our borders without permission. They're rogues. We eliminate the threat. Or we determine if they're actually a threat." Zafira straightened, meeting Briston's eyes across the table. "Send a scouting party. A small one, fast and defensive. Learn what's chasing them before we commit to a full assault on wolves that might be refugees rather than raiders." The war room erupted in protest. Warriors who had spent decades following Briston's decisive leadership bristled at the suggestion of caution. But Briston held up his hand, silence falling instantly at the gesture. He studied the map, his jaw tight, clearly wrestling with instinct versus strategy. "If you're wrong," he said slowly, "if they are raiders and we delay, the village could be attacked before we arrive. Then we also send a defensive force to the village," Zafira countered. "Protect our people while we gather information. If I'm wrong, we fight from a defensive position that favors us. If I'm right, we avoid starting a war with desperate wolves, who might become allies instead of enemies." The silence stretched for a long moment. Briston's golden eyes remained locked on hers, and she could feel him measuring the situation, weighing the risks, deciding whether to trust her instinct against years of training that said to strike first and ask questions later. Finally, he nodded. "We do both. Beta Kalen, take half the force to defend the village. Captain Thorne, you lead a small scouting party. Observe only, engage only if attacked. I'll lead the main force to a staging position between the rogues and the village. If they're fleeing, we offer sanctuary under controlled conditions. If they're raiding, we end it." He turned to Zafira. "You stay here where it's safe." "Absolutely not." Zafira moved around the table to stand directly in front of him. "If we're offering sanctuary to refugees, they'll need to see both the Alpha King's strength and the Queen's mercy. I go where you go." "Zafira." Briston's voice held warning, the Alpha in him balking at the idea of bringing his mate into potential danger. "Briston." She met his warning with calm certainty. "I'm not some fragile thing to be locked away while you fight. I'm your queen and your mate. We stand together, remember? That means in council rooms and on potential battlefields." The bond between them crackled with his conflict, the instinct to protect her warring with the knowledge that she was right, that diminishing her to keep her safe would damage the very partnership they had built. She could see the moment he surrendered, not to her demand, but to the truth of what they had become to each other. "You stay close to me," he said finally, his voice rough. "And if fighting starts, you follow my commands without question. This isn't negotiable." Agreed. Zafira knew when to push and when to accept terms. This was victory enough. Being included, being trusted to stand beside him even when every protective instinct he had screamed against it. They rode out within the hour, a force of 30 warriors moving swiftly through the night-darkened forest. Briston led from the front, Zafira beside him on a gray mare that matched her hair. She could feel the tension radiating through him, could sense his awareness focused on her as much as on the potential threat ahead. It should have annoyed her, that protective vigilance. Instead, it warmed something in her chest. He might growl at councils and intimidate enemies, but for her, his fierceness transformed into something softer. Protection instead of domination. Care instead of control. They reached the staging position just as Captain Thorne's scouts returned with their report. The rogue pack had indeed been fleeing, not raiding. They were pursued by hunters, humans with silver weapons, and the organization of professional wolf killers. The rogues were desperate, wounded, with several pups among their number. Briston's expression hardened. How many hunters? At least 20 that we could see. Possibly more. They're organized, well-equipped. This isn't random violence. This is systematic extermination. The words hung in the air like poison. Every wolf in the force felt the wrongness of it, the violation of the ancient laws that said humans and werewolves stayed separate, avoided direct conflict, except in the most extreme circumstances. Hunters that organized, that equipped, represented a threat not just to the rogues but to every pack in the region. Zafira moved her horse closer to Briston's. We have to help them. I know. His hand clenched on his reins. But bringing unknown wolves into our territory, wolves we have no bond to, no alliance with, it's a risk. So is letting hunters establish operations this close to our lands. Zafira kept her voice low, pitched for his ears alone. If we turn away refugees, we signal that we're willing to let wolves die, rather than extend protection. That weakness will draw more attacks, not fewer. But if we stand firm, if we demonstrate that our territory is a sanctuary for wolves in need, we establish ourselves as a power that hunters think twice before challenging. Briston turned to look at her, and she saw the moment he truly understood what she was offering. Not just strategy, but perspective. The long view versus the immediate risk, the political implications beyond the military ones. You're right, he said simply. Then louder, to the assembled warriors. We offer sanctuary to the rogues, and we send a message to the hunters that werewolf territory is not to be violated. Non-lethal force if possible, but make it clear that they hunt here at their own peril. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, splitting into groups. Some rode to intercept the rogues and offer protection. Others circled toward the hunter's position, ready to establish a perimeter. Briston and Zafira rode at the center of the force, the Alpha King's authority and the Queen's presence serving as a beacon for the desperate wolves they sought to aid. The rogues appeared through the trees like ghosts, thin, bleeding, terrified. A woman who appeared to be their leader stumbled forward, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Alpha King, she gasped, recognizing Briston immediately. Please, we mean no harm. We're just running. Briston finished, his voice gentler than Zafira had ever heard it outside their private chambers. I know. You're on Ashen Wolf land now. The hunters won't follow you here. He gestured to his warriors. Get them to safety. Medical attention for the wounded. Food and shelter for all of them. As the rogues were carefully surrounded by protective guards and led toward the heart of Ashen Wolf territory, Zafira watched Briston's face. He had made a choice that went against every tactical instinct, taking in unknown wolves, stretching his resources, accepting the risk of harboring potential enemies. He had done it not because strategy demanded it, but because it was right. Because the alternative was to let innocent wolves die, and that was something the man behind the Alpha King's crown could not accept. Her heart ached with the realization of how much weight he carried, how many impossible choices he made every day, how lonely it must have been to bear all of it alone for so many years. The hunters, when confronted by overwhelming werewolf force on claimed territory, retreated. Not without a fight. Several skirmishes broke out along the perimeter, silver weapons clashing against claw and fang. But Briston's warriors were better trained, better coordinated, and fighting with the righteous fury of wolves protecting their territory. Within an hour, the hunters had withdrawn, leaving behind only the acrid smell of gunpowder and silver and human fear. Briston stood at the edge of the battlefield, blood splattered across his armor, none of it his chest heaving with the aftermath of combat. The beast within him was still close to the surface, golden eyes glowing in the darkness, every muscle taut with residual aggression. This was the Alpha King the legend spoke of, the warrior who had never lost a battle, the predator who struck terror into enemies just by existing. Zafira approached him carefully, not from fear, but from respect for the state he was in. She had seen him commanding, seen him thoughtful, seen him gentle, but she had never seen him like this, covered in evidence of violence, radiating lethal capability, every inch the dominant alpha that ruled an entire kingdom through sheer force of will. She stepped into his space anyway, her hand coming to rest on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it thundering beneath her palm, could feel the beast within him recognizing her touch, and beginning, slowly, to settle. "Come back to me," she said softly. Not a command, but an invitation, a reminder that the battle was over, that he could put down the warrior's mantle and be just Briston again. His eyes focused on her, the glow fading gradually as the man reasserted control over the wolf. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it harder against his chest, as if anchoring himself through the contact. "You were right," he said, his voice still rough with the aftermath of combat. "About the rogues, about offering sanctuary. If we had attacked first. But you didn't." Zafira stepped closer, until no space remained between them. "You listened. You adapted. You chose mercy when you could have chosen violence. That's not weakness, Briston. That's the kind of strength that builds kingdoms, not just defends them." He pulled her against him then, uncaring of the blood that would stain her clothes, needing the contact to ground himself fully. The bond between them pulsed, warm and reassuring, reminding him that he wasn't alone anymore, that the weight he carried could be shared, the impossible choices made together, the burden of leadership distributed across two sets of shoulders instead of one. Around them, warriors were securing the perimeter and tending to the injured. But in that moment, in the circle of each other's arms, Briston and Zafira existed in a space apart from duty and danger. Just two souls that had somehow found each other against impossible odds, that had chosen to build something real amid crowns and ceremonies and the weight of an entire kingdom. "I need you," Briston said quietly, the admission raw and honest in a way he had never allowed himself to be before her. "Not just for strategy or perspective or balance. I need you, Zafira. The thought of you in danger, of losing you. You won't." She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm not fragile and I'm not going anywhere. We're bound, remember? By fate and choice and this impossible bond that grows stronger every day. You're stuck with me, Alpha King." "My puppy," he said, echoing her words from the ceremony with a slight smile that transformed his blood-spattered face into something almost boyish. "Your equal," she corrected gently. "Your partner, your queen. But yes, also your puppy if it reminds you that beneath all the power and duty, you're allowed to just be Briston sometimes, to be vulnerable, to need someone. I love you." The words escaped before he could think better of them, raw and unplanned, and more honest than anything he had ever said. "I didn't think I was capable of it. Love seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness enemies could exploit. But you make me want to be brave enough to feel it anyway." Zafira's breath caught. The bond between them flared bright and hot, responding to the emotion in his words. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "I think I have since that moment in the ceremony when I saw beneath the legend to the man. When I realized that your strength was real, yes, but so was your loneliness. And I needed, to reach that lonely part of you, and remind you that you didn't have to face everything alone." He kissed her then, there on the battlefield with his warriors moving around them, with the scent of combat still heavy in the air. He kissed her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, like she was air and water, and everything he needed to survive. And she kissed him back with equal fervor, pouring everything she felt into the connection, love and trust, and the absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. When they finally broke apart, Briston rested his forehead against hers. "Take me home," he murmured. "I need to wash the battle away and just hold you. No kingdom, no duty, no warriors, just us. Just us, Zafira agreed, her heart full to bursting with love for this complicated, powerful, vulnerable man who had somehow become her everything. They rode back to the castle in the pre-dawn darkness, the rescued rogues safe under guard, the hunters repelled, the crisis averted. But more than that, something had shifted between them. The bond had deepened into something beyond mystical connection. They had chosen each other, not just accepted fate's decree, but actively decided to build this partnership into something real and lasting and true. In the months that followed, the kingdom began to transform under their joint leadership. Briston remained the fierce warrior, the uncompromising alpha, the king who commanded absolute loyalty through strength. But now, that strength was tempered with wisdom drawn from Zafira's perspective, balanced with mercy when mercy served better than force, enhanced by a willingness to consider approaches that didn't rely solely on dominance and power. Zafira became beloved in her own right, not as a softening influence on the Alpha King, but as a force of nature in her own form. She established councils to address grievances that had been ignored, created systems to ensure the weakest pack members had voices that could reach the throne, reformed policies that served the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. And she did it all without diminishing Briston's authority, without undermining his strength, but by complementing it with her own unique gifts. Together, they were formidable. The court learned to respect Zafira, not because she was Briston's mate, but because she was brilliant and strategic, and absolutely fearless when defending her positions. The kingdom flourished under leadership that valued both strength and wisdom, both tradition and innovation, both the fierce protection of the Alpha King and the compassionate advocacy of his queen. But in private, in the quiet moments between duty and demand, they were simply two people who had found in each other something neither had known they were missing. Briston learned to laugh more freely, to share his burdens, to accept comfort and support, without seeing it as weakness. Zafira learned the weight of command, the loneliness of impossible choices, the strength required to lead with both heart and steel. They fought sometimes, passionate arguments that shook the castle walls when they disagreed on policy or approach. But they always came back together, the bond between them strong enough to weather conflict, their love deep enough to survive disagreement. Because they had built their partnership on honesty and respect, on seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway. The true test of their partnership came not from external threats, but from within. 6 months after the Hunter incident, Zafira discovered she was pregnant. The news should have brought pure joy, but instead, it awakened a new kind of fear in Briston, one that had nothing to do with battle or politics, and everything to do with the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone so completely that the thought of losing them became unbearable. He became overprotective, hovering, restricting her movements in ways that made Zafira's independent spirit chafe. Council meetings became arguments about whether she should rest more, travel less, take fewer risks. The warriors noticed the tension between their rulers, the way the Alpha King's attention split constantly between his duties and ensuring his mate remained safe. It came to a head during a storm-lashed night when Zafira insisted on attending a border dispute negotiation, despite Briston's objections. They stood in their chambers, the rain hammering against the windows like accusations, both of them rigid with frustration and fear. "You could lose the pup," Briston said, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "One wrong move, one unexpected attack, one moment of stress. Or I could spend the next months wrapped in cotton, useless to the kingdom, diminished to nothing more than a vessel." Zafira's eyes flashed with anger. "Is that what you want? To reduce me to the very thing I refused to be when we met? I want you safe." The words exploded from him, raw and desperate. "I want you alive. I want our child to have a mother. I want—" His voice broke, and he turned away, his hands clenching into fists. "I cannot lose you, Zafira. I will not survive it. I have been many things in my life, warrior, king, leader, weapon, but I have never been afraid until you. until I understood what it meant to have something more precious than my own life walking around in the world, vulnerable to every danger I cannot control. The honesty of it shattered Zafira's anger. She moved to him, her hands gentle on his rigid shoulders. "Briston, look at me." He turned, and she saw the fear naked in his golden eyes. Not the controlled concern of an alpha for his pack, but the raw terror of a man facing the possibility of losing everything that made his life worth living. "I'm not made of glass," she said softly. "This pregnancy doesn't erase who I am or what I'm capable of. Yes, we'll be more careful. Yes, some risks aren't worth taking right now. But if you try to lock me away, if you treat me like a fragile thing instead of your partner, you'll destroy the very thing you're trying to protect. Not my body, but us. The partnership we built. The respect and equality that made our bond real instead of just mystical." Briston's hands came up to frame her face, his touch infinitely gentle despite the strength coiled in his frame. "I don't know how to do this. How to be strong enough to protect you, but not so controlling that I smother you. How to honor your independence while keeping you safe. How to be the alpha king and just Briston at the same time." "The same way we've done everything else," Zafira said, covering his hands with hers. "Together, we compromise. We communicate. We trust each other to know our own limits, while also trusting each other's concern. You don't make decisions for me, and I don't dismiss your fears. We navigate this the way we've navigated everything, as equals who love each other enough to be honest even when it's hard." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "I'm going to be insufferable, aren't I? Constantly worried, probably hovering, definitely driving you mad with protective instincts I can't fully control." "Probably." Zafira smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him gently. "But I'm going to be stubborn and independent and occasionally reckless in ways that make you want to lock me in a tower for my own good. So I suppose we're even." "I love you," Briston said, the words coming easier now than they had a year ago, natural as breathing. "More than the kingdom, more than the crown, more than my own life. And that terrifies me because I've never been powerless before, never been at the mercy of something I couldn't fight or control. But this, you, our child, this life we're building, I can't protect any of it through force alone." "No," Zafira agreed, her hands moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "You protect it by being present, by being my partner, by trusting that we're strong enough together to handle whatever comes. And by remembering that the fiercest protection you can offer our child is showing them what real partnership looks like. Two parents who respect each other, challenge each other, and choose each other every single day." They held each other through the storm, the rain eventually gentling to a soft patter against the windows, the thunder rolling away into distance. And in the quiet aftermath, they talked, really talked, about fears and hopes, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about how to balance duty and family, about building a future that honored both their strengths. The months that followed tested them in new ways. Zafira's pregnancy progressed, and they learned together how to navigate the changing dynamics. Briston learned to channel his protective instincts into support rather than control, to trust Zafira's judgment about her own capabilities while also being honest about his concerns. Zafira learned to accept help without seeing it as weakness, to acknowledge when rest was needed without viewing it as failure. The kingdom watched their alpha pair with growing respect and affection. Here was a king who was strong enough to show vulnerability, fierce enough to be gentle, powerful enough to defer to his mate's wisdom when it exceeded his own. Here was a queen who was independent enough to accept support, wild enough to be tamed only by choice, strong enough to demand equality even in moments of physical vulnerability. When their daughter was born on a spring morning, with dawn breaking golden over the castle walls, Briston wept openly. He held the tiny, perfect creature with hands that had ended battles and commanded armies, and he trembled with the overwhelming love and terror of it. Zafira, exhausted but radiant, watched him with eyes full of tenderness. "Hello, little one," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your father, and I promise you, I will be fierce to the world but gentle with you. I will be strong enough to protect you, but wise enough to let you grow. I will be everything you need me to be, because you and your mother have taught me that true strength isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being brave enough to love, despite the fear." Zafira reached out, and Briston carefully settled beside her on the bed, their daughter cradled between them. The bond pulsed with their shared joy, their shared fear, their shared absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. "She has your eyes," Zafira said softly, tracing a finger over their daughter's tiny features. "Golden, like winter sun. She'll be fierce." "And she has your hair," Briston countered, touching the downy white fuzz on the baby's head. "She'll be fearless. Gods help us." They named her Lyanna, after Zafira's grandmother, who had taught her that strength came in many forms. And as the castle celebrated the birth of the heir, as the kingdom rejoiced in the continuation of the Ashenwolf line, Briston and Zafira held their daughter and each other and marveled at the life they had built from 4 defiant words spoken during a ceremony. Time continued its relentless march. Lyanna grew into a child who embodied the best of both her parents, fierce and fearless, strong and gentle, commanding respect through authenticity rather than fear. She watched her father rule with strength tempered by wisdom, and she watched her mother navigate court politics with grace sharpened by steel. She learned that power came in many forms, that true strength required vulnerability, that the greatest leaders were those who remained humble enough to keep learning. The kingdom prospered under Briston and Zafira's joint rule. Trade flourished. Alliances strengthened. The refugee wolves who had been offered sanctuary integrated into the pack, bringing new skills and perspectives that enriched everyone. The borders remained secure not because they were defended with overwhelming force alone, but because the Ashenwolf territory became known as a place where strength and justice coexisted, where mercy balanced might, where wolves could find both protection and freedom. But more than any political achievement or territorial expansion or economic growth, Briston and Zafira's greatest legacy was the transformation of what leadership could mean. They proved that an alpha king could be vulnerable without weakness, that a queen could be independent without undermining her mate's authority. That true partnership required neither submission nor dominance, but mutual respect and complementary strengths. A year after the ceremony, on the anniversary of the day Zafira had called Briston her puppy and changed both their lives forever, they stood together on the castle balcony overlooking the kingdom spread below. Lyanna slept peacefully in her nursery, watched over by guards who would die before letting harm reach her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Briston had his arms wrapped around Zafira from behind, her back pressed against his chest. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Accepting a mate who refuses to be traditional? Who challenges you constantly? Who called you her puppy in front of the entire kingdom?" Briston's arms tightened around her, his chin resting on top of her head. "Not for a single moment. You saved me, Zafira, from becoming so isolated by my own power that I forgot how to be anything except the Alpha King. You reminded me that I could be strong and vulnerable, fierce and gentle, a warrior and a man. You gave me permission to be whole instead of just powerful." "You did the same for me," Zafira said, turning in his arms to face him. "You could have demanded submission, could have forced me into the mold of what everyone expected a queen to be. Instead, you gave me space to be myself, to bring my strengths to our partnership, to stand beside you as an equal instead of behind you as an accessory." The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the gardens below, mixing with the familiar comfort of their combined scents. Frost and pine, wildness and strength, perfectly balanced. Zafira reached up to trace the line of Briston's jaw, feeling the familiar scratch of his beard against her palm. I used to think love was a weakness, Briston admitted, his voice low and intimate in the gathering darkness. Something that made you vulnerable to manipulation and pain. My father taught me that an alpha stands alone, that depending on others creates cracks enemies can exploit. He ruled through fear and isolation, and when he died, no one mourned him. They respected his strength, but never loved the man behind it. And now? Zafira asked, though she could feel the answer through the bond that connected them. Now I know that love is the greatest strength I possess. Not because it makes me invulnerable, but because it makes me brave enough to be vulnerable. You, Leanna, the life we've built, these are worth any risk, any sacrifice, any battle I'll ever face. His hands moved to her face, tilting it up so their eyes met in the fading light. You're my mate, Zafira, in every sense of the word. My equal, my partner, my love, my challenge, my comfort. The bond brought us together, but we chose to make it real, to build something that transcends fate or ceremony or expectation. And I wouldn't change a single thing about you or us or the journey that brought us here. Tears pricked at Zafira's eyes. Happy tears, the kind that came from being completely known and completely loved anyway. You know what the irony is? I called you my puppy to challenge you, to test whether you were strong enough to handle a woman who wouldn't bow. But you ended up teaching me that true strength isn't about never bowing. It's about choosing when to stand firm and when to yield, when to challenge, and when to support. You made me better, Briston. Stronger because I learned that accepting help and showing vulnerability don't diminish me. They complete me. My puppy, Zafira said softly, the words carrying none of the defiance they had held during the ceremony. Now they were pure affection, an endearment born of intimacy and trust, a reminder of the moment that had changed everything. Your mate, Briston corrected gently, but he was smiling that rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish. Always and forever, your mate. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise. The kiss held everything, the fire of their first meeting, the tenderness of their growing love, the absolute certainty of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, Briston rested his forehead against hers. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For being brave enough to challenge me. For seeing beneath the legend to the man. For calling me your puppy and waking something in me I didn't know had fallen asleep. For choosing me every day, even when I'm difficult, or overprotective, or too caught up in duty. For giving me a daughter who will grow up knowing that strength comes in many forms, and that the greatest power is choosing who you love and how you love them. For being exactly who you are, without apology or diminishment. For making me want to be better, not different, but better. A king who serves as much as he commands. A father who guides as much as he protects. A mate who listens as much as he leads. Zafira's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in the moonlight that had begun to replace the sunset's glow. You already are all of those things. You were always capable of it. You just needed someone to believe you were more than the legend, more than the warrior, more than the crown. You needed someone to love Briston, not just respect the Alpha King. And you're that someone. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I'm that someone. Today, tomorrow, 50 years from now when we're old and gray and watching our grandchildren play in these gardens. I'm that someone, Briston. Your partner, your equal, your love, your puppy. If that's what reminds you that beneath all the power and prestige, you're allowed to be human, to be vulnerable, to be loved not for what you can do, but for who you are. They stood together in the moonlight, the kingdom peaceful below them, their daughter safe in her nursery, the bond between them stronger than ever. And in that moment, everything was perfect. Not because they had no challenges left to face, or no battles left to fight, but because they knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together. The Alpha King and his queen, the warrior and the wild, two souls that had found in each other the perfect balance of strength and vulnerability, power and compassion, legend and truth. They had built something rare and beautiful from the ashes of loneliness and expectation, had forged a partnership that would be remembered long after they were gone. And it had all started with 4 simple words spoken in defiance and recognized in wonder. "You're my puppy." The bond had awakened within him that day, yes. But more than that, Briston Ashenwolf had awakened to the possibility that he could be more than just the untouchable Alpha King. He could be known. He could be loved. He could be chosen. And he had been. By a woman brave enough to challenge him, strong enough to stand beside him, and wise enough to see the man beneath the crown. Together, they would face whatever came. Together, they would build a kingdom that valued strength in all its forms. Together, they would prove that the greatest power came not from dominance alone, but from the courage to be vulnerable with the right person. Together, they were complete. And that was the greatest magic of all. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.